In the 56 years since I was sent to Key West as a Top Gun fighter pilot instructor, after 2 combat tours in Vietnam, I've been chairman of the zoning board of the Comprehensive Plan Drafting Committee and appeared 55 times in front of the governor and cabinet regarding growth mismanagement in the Florida Keys. I was in the cabinet chambers when they declared critical concern and played a big part in that whole process. As chairman of the 501c3 Florida Keys Citizens Coalition, I spoke to you yesterday, as today, of some fundamental flaws in the 2012 model that you're going to reuse. But since some different local officials are here today, I'm sure they'd like me to reread the section where I quote the state's leading expert on hurricane evacuation modeling. This, I would remark again, is sworn testimony under oath, Alameda campers, in a court of law during the citizen lawsuit against the Governor Scott's 1,300 bonus campaign ROGO permits that he had these good folks issue with no choice of their own. So here we go. Everything I'm going to read you is a quote from the official transcript of sworn testimony by the state's leading expert, who happens to be Richard Ogburn. He does the modeling for the whole state. I'm not going to read you everything. I'm going to read you a few choice phrases. You can make the quotation marks on your own. Every word I speak is going to be a quote from this transcript. The state asked me to provide the updated demographic data for the entire state, which I did. That's his job. I did observe one of the tables, the one which identified the number of vehicles in each census block group, was blank. I reached the conclusion that the Census Bureau had, in fact, suppressed the data in some cases. There was some blank lines, and the data simply wasn't there. I was able to determine that, indeed, out of the 76 block groups for Monroe County, Roman, there were 8 of them. 8 of them were missing the vehicle data. For site-built homes, 4,500 and change. It's actually 4,509. It's my editorial. 4,500 and change, there were 660-something mobile home vehicles. At the request of the department, I reran the scenario M5, which is the evacuation model. For 4,500 additional vehicles associated with site-built homes, the impact of the exclusion was an increase of 2.5 hours in clearance time. Added to 24, that's 26.5. We have been in violation of state law, Chapter 380, since at least 2012, which is the erroneous model run that these data blanks occurred in. Further testimony. These are the emails that I prepared and sent to the department with regards to the difference that I had discovered. If you want to look them up, they're petitioners 54 and 55 in the lawsuit. Emails that he sent to all the participants in the MOU that we were 2.5 hours in violation of Florida law. Since the model run in 2012. What is it? Let me see. That means we've had an 11-year grace period in which we've been allowed to violate Florida law and keep on our merry way with overdeveloping the Florida Keys. Just before he leaves the stand, back to quoting. Let me just make a point that I think is important. The Monroe County model runs at some level present an artificial run because they essentially are a Monroe County only evacuation. In the statewide regional evacuation study program, all of our planning scenarios were regional. Not just one county was evacuating. For the purposes of the MOU, where the Monroe County only runs. Editorial. That means 66 counties in the state did multi-county evac runs, and Monroe County, the most vulnerable arguably in the state, pretends that while we're all fleeing for our lives from the Florida Keys, nobody from Homestead to West Palm Beach has left their house. That is preposterous and potentially seriously fatal impacts. For the purposes of the MOU, Monroe County only runs, meaning no other hurricane evacuation activities in the other counties in our region at the time the Monroe County evacuations were being run. Closing statement. That is not, quote, that is not a realistic assumption, but it is the one that was used by the department in the county. That's pretty serious stuff, campers. I don't have it in the transcript, but I heard him say it because the last question he was asked was that, well, did you ever run a more realistic model of the simultaneous four-county evacuation of South Florida? And he said that he had, which was a surprise. I didn't know he'd done it, never seen it. Lawyers hadn't seen it. He said, well, what was the result? And he said, about 35 hours. We need to be talking reality here, not theoretical studies. I think he's going to correct it this time, but the model currently presumes that old people, retired people, elderly people drive at the same rate in the middle of the night as the model uses the same flow rate, 24 hours, when somewhere around 40% of any evacuation period is going to be in the dark. How about if it's raining? I bet everybody in this room knows at least a handful of older folks that don't ever drive at night anymore, and are sure not going to be driving at night in the rain. Since there is no point pretending that there's not a multi-billion-dollar lobbying effort to convince these great folks at this, well-intentioned folks at this great agency with lots of authority I hope they figure out how to use, to arrange the numbers so that the result is we can keep developing in the Florida Keys. There's a multi-billion-dollar industry that would love to do that. They've been successful so far on modifying a bunch of these numbers from where they probably should have been. There are many other flaws. I'll be happy to go over that with the Islamorada Council sometime by request. These folks heard it yesterday. But because DEO, by whatever future name you know, yeah, I know. I was going to say something less kind, but I decided not to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. I've known personally at least a half a dozen secretaries of DCA, DEO over the years because of my involvement in all the growth management history. But they will continue to have review authority over every new building permit that the political, real estate, and development interests are lobbying heavily to create room for during these revisions that this hearing is part of. Because of DEO's future function, the serious hyper-expensive deficiencies in Florida Keys basic infrastructure need to be recognized in these official proceedings. Even though you're focused on talking about the evacuation, the decisions you make about who to count and who not to count are going to have a direct effect on future development in the Keys, which we're supposed to be at the end of, and there's a lot of well-heeled interests don't want us to be at the end of. I would point out, for instance, that the delightful highway trenching construction that I hope you enjoyed in Alameda and Tavernier is not temporary, and it's not short term. That's the first 4 miles of a 130-mile water pipe that's corroded and periodically bursting and leaking often. A 130-mile project, which they only have 5 miles of funding for. But it's going to go on, and much of it's going to be under the southbound lane of US 1, where they dig a trench and bury pipe and cones everywhere and so forth. If any of that's going on, and it will be during an evacuation period, mama, we got a problem. That project has been estimated by the director of the Aqueduct Authority at the cost of upwards of $2 billion for the 130 miles that need to be replaced. Money they don't have. The same Aqueduct Authority took on sewage treatment in the lower Keys. This is a photograph of the billion-dollar sewage treatment plant on Cudjoe. There's 5 units in that system. It started leaking raw sewage, untreated sewage, 3 years after they spent $1 billion building it. It currently is under 2 consent orders from DEP and a warning letter. And they have, this is the 4th Miami Herald expose. There's a 5th one with some more updated figures you could download today, and you probably should. This is what they do with the freshwater pipe. This is the freshwater pipe that blew up Easter week. You see the size of that rupture and the amount of distortion of the metal? They were running 26 million gallons, full bore, running the reverse osmosis plant full bore because we were full of tourists. And they blew the pipe out. They had 4 failures in a week. So we got a problem with the fresh water coming into your house, and we got a problem with the sewage going out of your house. And it's the same agency. They have such a colorful history that 43 years ago, I managed to convince Governor Bob Graham to seize control of the Aqueduct Authority, which he did, to build the last pipeline because of the lack of state confidence in what would happen if they didn't. I point out, by the way, the director has said in various locations it'll take 10 or 20 or even 30 years to replace this pipeline. Governor Graham's team in the South Florida Water Management District did it in 2.5 years. The point is, we don't have the infrastructure for more development. We don't have the infrastructure for the development we have now. There's a Florida statute that requires 20 PSI, look it up, politicians, 20 PSI minimum water pressure connection at the residence in public water systems to prevent intrusion of contaminated groundwater, of course. And back when Bob Graham seized control of this agency, we had documented logbooks with 10, 12 PSI. The shower didn't work on the 2nd floor. We have serious fundamental infrastructure problems that we're in no danger of fixing in the short term. And that all needs to be recognized because you're going to be dealing with the aftermath if you make unjustified. Of course you're going to be lobbied to make all kinds of exceptions so we can go on our merry way. But there are, as I'm fond of remarking from time to time, the folks that already live here have property rights, damn it. They already live here. That's the biggest problem with the illegal vacation rentals, of which there are countless numbers. The neighbors who, their life savings to raise their kids in a single-family residential neighborhood, and their neighbor is running a hotel and not paying infrastructure taxes. Many of these are not licensed, which means they're not paying. What do we get, Roman? $0.50 out of the sales tax to pay our infrastructure costs. They should be contributing. These people are making fortunes. I had a customer, I told this crowd, I had a customer in my dive shop last month, had 17 people, 3 families in a duplex in Marathon. Why isn't he paying a lot more taxes than all you residents are? He's using lots more garbage, lots more sewage, lots more water. And of course, the final piece of infrastructure, which you won't think is any of your business, but it is because it's the unavoidable consequence. I got elected to 4 years on the Florida Keys Wide School Board, and I went after the finances because they were colorfully managed. And the last 3 schools we built cost $37, $38, and $39 million apiece on property we already owned. We wrapped them around the existing schools and then knocked the old school down. But they're all full because the old schools were full. And you can't build only just a little bit, maybe 10% new capacity, already full. How are we going to deal with that? Your planners will estimate, what, 2.5 people per unit? Is that still the standard planning figure? I think.
That would be what census tells us.
Yeah, about roughly 2.5. That half is a kid. So for 1,000 people, on the average, you got 500 kids. You don't get 500 kids together and then build a school. As soon as you got a couple hundred kids, you got to be underway. And that's an enormous infrastructure cost that I never used to have a real number for, but I can give you lots of real documents now. And Roman, where are you going to find enough property to build a new school? And for how much? We'll be talking about $75 million, $80 million schools, easy peasy. We just don't have the infrastructure. And by the way, parting remark, my well-known environmental lawyer, whom you guys all know, has shown me a list of considerable number of recent Florida cases in which local governments were ruled not to be responsible, legally responsible for expanding infrastructure to subsidize more developers, only for maintaining the infrastructure you already have. So we shouldn't be playing that part of underwriting an industry that could well afford to pay a hell of a lot fairer share of the costs to the rest of the community. I just hope to God we don't perpetrate some of these injustices and some of these utter fantasies about evacuation. But I'm so genuinely delighted that you guys took the trouble to come down here, enjoy the traffic. That's a bonus, I know. But really, that you came down here in person. I'm impressed that the evacuation guy actually knows the names of the facilities, because I've been at lots of hearings where they had no idea what they were talking about. So enjoy the traffic on your way out. And remember that when that rusty old pipe blew up that I showed you, that's a 30-inch pipe. It blew all the fill out from under the right side of the road, and the Miami-Dade Greyhound-sized bus that shuffles indentured servants down from the slums of Homestead to work in our hotels instead of us, paying a living wage. Thought they were driving through a mud puddle, pulling back on. The buses all pull on and off the shoulder of the road here, the whole length of the Keys. He thought he was driving through a mud puddle, and it was a blowout trench, and the bus rolled over within a few degrees of all the way over on its side. And what I suggest to people is they think of that bus painted yellow full of school kids, because school buses do that in hundreds of locations every day in the Florida Keys. And you don't want to be interviewed about that one, I'll guarantee you. Thanks for coming, genuinely.